Hi, I'm Kerrie Penney, and on this episode of Secret Heart Broadcasting, we are talking about how money works with Senior Wealth Advisor Jody McLaughlin. If you have questions about money, how to talk to your kids about money, your partner about money, am I saving enough for my retirement? How does money work? Then this episode is for you. Hello, welcome to Secret Heart Broadcasting. I'm Kerrie Penney, and today our episode is all about money. Did your family talk about money? I don't know. Mine didn't. It was forbidden. I know we didn't have a lot of it. My mom was a saver and my dad was a spender, so I got all kinds of messages about money. I knew I left home early and I knew I had to make a living, which I've done for a number of years. I'm kind of the OG gig economy person, in that the last time I worked for someone was, 40 years ago. So I knew that I needed to make money and I knew I had to pay bills, but I never really had a philosophy about money or understood money in a meaningful way. But Jody McLaughlin has and does. Jody is a senior wealth advisor with the Susan O'Brien Group Wealth Advisory at Richardson Wealth, and I hope I got that right. And for 20 years, she's been assisting people to manage their money. And she's also been traveling and painting and living her life and pointing herself in the right direction, or the direction she wants to go. And she knows a lot about money. So Jody, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm wondering if you grew up in a family that talked about money.
Yeah, I did not really grow up in a family that talked about money. Now, that's not to say that there weren't observations that I made about money, but there certainly wasn't any kind of formal lessons. So what I mean by observations is, I would observe like my mom balancing her checkbook, or, you understood this concept of going to the store and exchanging money for goods or whatnot, but no specific lessons. It was kind of just those informal learnings, if you will. But that doesn't mean that I didn't kind of come across certain concepts on my own. One that I remember most vividly, and this was as a 4-year-old, was what that pot of like Halloween candy could really be. So this was when people ask me, like, what do you first remember about money? It's not dollars and cents and bills and things like that. It's my annual lottery win of Halloween candy. And with that pot of Halloween candy, what I learned is that, what I valued as little 4-year-old Jody, which was caramel, of course, that was absolute gold to me as a child. That was not what my brother valued, for example, or what he was interested in. So this pool of money this pool of candy gave me some resources to barter with my brother for things that I wanted, or things that I wanted him to maybe do. And it kind of, what I learned through that was what I now understand to be concepts of value and bartering, and what someone else may want is not really the same as what I may want. And then also, because I was always a natural saver, if I saved some of this candy, then I'd have this little pool that I could go to later for when I next wanted something, say, from my brother.
I love the observant, 4-year-old who realizes that things have value. And there's certainly some clues to the kind of kid you were. But, what else was there? What kind of a child were you, Jody McLaughlin?
I think I was a pretty well-rounded child, but I certainly had some strong traits. Being really observant was one of them. And where that really helped was because I was also just a ferocious learner. I just wanted to learn as much as I could about everything and anything. And I was so impatient to learn as much as I could. So whether that was, observing behaviors or getting books from the library, or, being a good student in school, like I just wanted to learn everything that I possibly could. Now, those two traits are sometimes great. The impatience part of it, a little less so. But thankfully, I was also a very organized kid, and I did have a natural sort of inclination to planning. And without that, I don't know how I would have controlled the other two things. But I grew up wanting to do all different sorts of things, from learning as much as I could about different fields of study. I was pretty athletic as a kid as well. I used to love running anywhere that I could run to. It's just burst of speed was also as great as a burst of knowledge to me. And loved solving puzzles. I was creative as well. So all in all, I think a pretty well-rounded kid.
Wow, I love that. A burst of speed was as good as a burst of knowledge. That is highly quotable. So it sounds like you really well, were kind of a Renaissance kid. Like you could have done anything. What led you to pursue a career in finance?
A little bit of a long story. The short version of it is I fundamentally did play to my strengths. I do have a natural inclination to plan. But then I also, followed some interests that started to make themselves clear to me over time. And so when I was, a young kid, like in grade school type of thing, early grades, I wasn't particularly interested in math. I found math to be rather boring and repetitive, and I was a frequent complainer using these terms to my mother, who finally at one day probably just got really fed up and said, Jodi, math is how a lot of science is explained, so maybe you should give it a little more credit. Something to that effect. And that was really impactful to me because I love science more than absolutely anything. So I was like, okay, if this will help me better understand science, then maybe I'll put more effort in. So I became good at math, but it honestly wasn't until one unit in 10th grade math class that I was really, we got to this kind of like finance unit called time value of money. It wasn't until then that I really started to look for more specific finance knowledge. And when I tell this story, I always wonder if people go, oh, you're just saying this because of what you do as a wealth advisor. Like, this can't be a real story. But it absolutely is. It was 10th grade math class. We get to this time value of money unit, and it was like a secret of the universe was revealed to me that day about how I could make, what was previously my little pile of Halloween candy. It ultimately became, a bank account and savings and stuff. How could I actually make that grow? How could I actually make that be something where I wouldn't have to worry about money? I would be able to alleviate the stress that I did recognize as a kid existed. Like, you could see it in my parents. I mean, I have 2 working parents. I have 3 siblings. Time and money were both stressors. That day in math class was like a pivotal day where I learned what I could really kind of do if I properly managed my pool of savings at the time. So that part became a bit of an obsession.
An aha moment.
It was an aha moment,
Yeah.
yes. And so it wasn't that I hadn't thought about different career paths as a kid. Of course I had. It's just finance didn't really play into it until a much later time. For a long time, like most prairie kids that are obsessed with water, I really wanted to be a marine biologist. Up until I think I learned somewhere that most marine biologists don't do like cool things like dive with sharks, and instead spent an inordinate amount of time chasing grant money and studying like algae or something. So I did pivot from some previous things, but it started to grow from that day, I would say, a little bit in math class. And then also when I got into university age, when I first started university, I had the intention of being a lawyer. And I thought it was going to be a real great idea to be a lawyer that understood numbers. So I ultimately chose commerce as my undergrad with a concentration in accounting. But like I kind of got bored with math, or was bored with math and found it repetitive as a young child, I did find that with accounting as well. And so I ultimately did change out of that to get a more kind of well-rounded commerce degree. And I got to do cool things like negotiations and labor relations and all this sort of neat stuff. And eventually, while I was going through all of this process, I was starting to kind of understand that, all the stress that I was feeling, trying to still be a really good student, work while in university, because I did have to do that, and then just manage everything else in your life at that age that you're still trying to do. It was really, really stressful. And I thought, law school is really just going to extend this period of stress in my life. And then I'm sure future lawyer Jodi, if that person ever existed, would laugh at undergrad Jodi and how stressed she found it and think, oh, you little lamb, you had no idea. So I was kind of starting to think that future was maybe going to be one that I wasn't super happy with. So I was starting to evaluate other options. And then, along the way here, while I was doing my undergrad, I mentioned that I was working through it. I was working mostly at a bank. And what I learned through working at the bank and seeing everyday people making everyday financial decisions, both good and bad, was I found that interesting. This was not something that I ever thought that I would. I didn't really give it much thought. I was certainly interested in my own financial capabilities and my own financial decisions, but I didn't realize that I was interested in others. And then that experience did get built upon when one of the options I took in one semester was actually a personal finance course as part of my degree. And as you can imagine, in that type of course, your primary project is a financial plan. And the prof had said to the class at large, like, your plan is due in a couple weeks, but if you get it to me by the end of this week, I'll review it, and then I'll give you back any comments before it goes for final grading. And I thought, well, I can submit it. I was an early bird with coursework and stuff. I never really liked a deadline. I think that relates to that impatient part as well. I had it ready to go and I handed it in. I had no idea what comments I was going to get back. I was pretty confident in what I'd written. But when I got it back, I just stared at it for a second, because what he wrote on it was, "This course needs a tutor. Do you want a job?" And so I was like, okay, this would be something that would look good on a resume, in addition to, being at a bank and stuff like that. This could possibly open some doors in the future. And so the next time the course was offered, I was the tutor for both undergrads and MBAs. And I got to build on that kind of insight that I was gaining at the bank of, people making everyday decisions I got to read all of these people's financial plans, which included all of their goals. So I got to understand the why of things. And so again, I found that interesting. So eventually I ultimately graduated. I had all of these kind of like new inklings of where I could possibly go. And I was still working at the bank at that time. And I ultimately got introduced to the wealth management world by a broker who had a sub kind of office at the bank level. And he introduced me to a colleague who was looking for someone to join their team. And that's how I entered the world of wealth management and working with the kinds of people that I get to do now.
Well, I love that in listening to that, and I have a million questions just bubbling, but you had a sense of future Jodi and now present Jodi, and you were always kind of, pivoting or just following your way to honor what you knew to be true for you. And you were so young at the time. I absolutely love that. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please tell your friends.